Right, so I decided to do my news presentation on Bill C-81, the Accessible Canada Act. So the purpose of this bill is to create a barrier-free Canada for those with disabilities under federal jurisdiction. It clearly outlines and defines both barrier and disability. So barrier includes anything that is physical, architectural, technological, or attitudinal, anything that is based on information or communication, or anything that is the result of a policy or a practice that hinders the full and equal participation in society of persons with physical, mental, intellectual, learning, communication, or sensory impairment or a functional limitation. Disability refers to a physical, mental, intellectual, learning, communication, or sensory impairment or a functional limitation, whether permanent, temporary, or episodic in nature, that in interaction with a barrier hinders a person's full and equal participation in society. The first reading was held on June 29th, 2018, and the second reading was held on September 19th, 2018. So the government allocated $290 million over 6 years to support the implementation of this act. The bill sets out the framework on how to identify and remove accessibility barriers and how to prevent new barriers from arising in the following. Built environments, so building and public spaces, employment, so employment opportunities as well as employment policies and practices, information and communication technologies, so digital content and the technology used to access it, the procurement of goods and services, and transportation. Also, the bill allows the government to list any new priorities in the future. So the principle of the bill includes, so it presents understanding that barriers to accessibility encompass the core of inequality between Canadians with and without disabilities. So the principles of focus include inherent dignity, equal opportunity, barrier-free government, autonomy, and inclusivity, and meaningful involvement. So who has to comply? All organizations under the federal responsibility, which include Parliament, Government of Canada, federally regulated private sector, Canadian Forces, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So the roles and responsibilities of the minister. So the Minister of Sport and Persons with Disabilities appointed responsible for the Act. The responsibilities include implementing policies and programs related to accessibility, collecting and analyzing and publishing data related to accessibility, cooperating with provincial and territorial governments to organize efforts in relation to accessibility, reporting annually to Parliament on their activities in support of accessibility, launching periodic independent reviews of the Act and reporting these reviews to Parliament. The Government of Canada will appoint an independent Chief Accessibility Officer who is responsible for overseeing the implementation of the Act across all sectors. The Minister of Transport and Canadian Transportation Agency will continue to be responsible for ensuring accessibility within federal transportation. The Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission will continue to be responsible for accessibility within broadcasting and telecommunication services. So, duties of the federal organizations. So, all organizations under federal responsibility must implement accessibility plans. So, all organizations must create accessibility plans in consultation with individuals with disabilities. It must outline strategies to improve accessibility and must meet legal responsibilities outlined by the law. Feedback tools. So all organizations are responsible for creating methods of receiving and responding to feedback relating to accessibility from their employees and their customers. And progress reports. So all organizations must prepare and publish progress reports that outline how their organization is meeting their requirements in relation to accessibility. So complaints. So legislation gives rights for individuals to contest and receive compensation if they have experienced physical, psychological, or financial hardship due to an organization's oversight in relation to their accessibility requirements outlined by law. Four parties responsible for complaints include the Canadian Radio Television Telecommunications, deal with complaints related to accessibility barriers in broadcasting and telecommunication services. So the Canadian Transport Agency deal with complaints related to accessibility barriers within the federal transportation system. The Federal Public Sector Labor Relations and Employment Board deal with the complaints related to accessibility barriers within the public sector. Finally, the Accessibility Commissioner will deal with any other complaints related to accessibility barriers. So, enforcing accessibility by law. So, to ensure that all organizations meet compliancy, proactive strategies must be implemented. These strategies include inspections. So, an officer to conduct inspections to ensure all organizations follow the requirements and regulations outlined by law. Compliance audits. So, officers may examine an organization's records and other relevant documents to ensure the requirements and regulations outlined by the law are being followed. And lastly, compliance orders. If an officer believes an organization is not meeting their responsibilities as outlined by law, they can issue an order for said organization to start or stop an activity to meet compliance standards. Fines for violating the accessibility law can be fined as high as $250,000. So, benefits of Bill C-81, the Accessible Canada Act. So, a barrier-free Canada. So, the Act aims to create a barrier-free Canada for those with disabilities. New important officials and agencies. So, the Act creates new and important officials and agencies. Accessibility Commissioner, who is responsible for enforcement of the Act. A Canadian Accessibility Standards Development Organization to produce an accessibility standard modeled to use as regulations. And a Chief Accessibility Officer, who is responsible for advising and reporting on the progress and improvements required for the Act. So, effective enforcement and public accountability. So, the Act aims to provide effective enforcement and public accountability for accessibility efforts. So, the Act imposes a duty on all organizations to create accessibility plans that enforce collaboration with those with disabilities in order to do so. So, the Act helps to raise awareness about what is needed to achieve effective access for those with disabilities. The Act allows for a more welcomed conversation regarding barriers that limit those with disabilities. The Act uses a human rights approach to disability by shifting the perspective of disability from objects of charity to valued right holders. And finally, the Act enforces full citizenship rights for those with disabilities by encompassing the 5 principles discussed earlier, which include highlighting their rights in regards to dignity, equal opportunity, a barrier-free government, autonomy, inclusivity, and meaningful involvement. So there are some shortcomings of the Bill C-81 Accessible Canada Act. So there are no set timelines for achieving accessibility or for the major implementation steps needed in order to carry out the Act. Without having an official launch date, those with disabilities are expected to face accessibility barriers for the indefinite future. Although the Act enables the government to create accessibility standards and regulations, it does not enforce the government to actually do so. The Act specifies 4 agencies involved in enforcing and implementing the Act. This risks inconsistent enforcement and implementation. Having multiple agencies involved in enforcing and implementing the Act will generate a lot of frustration and confusion. Consider the process for filing a complaint. A complaint may be filed with the Accessibility Commissioner, who could decide that the complaint is better dealt with by the Human Rights Commission, who could then refuse to investigate the case as they feel as though it is better handled elsewhere, thus creating a catch-22 effect. Furthermore, the Act allows 2 already existing public agencies, the CRTC and the CTA, to oversee accessibility efforts despite their history of ineffectively dealing with and implementing these efforts regardless of having an accessibility mandate. The bill allows for many exemptions and allows too much power for public officials to exempt an organization from key components of the Act. The bill does not adequately ensure that the federal government uses all resources and power to promote accessibility within Canada, as the bill does not require the government to re-examine existing legislation and regulations in regards to possible accessibility barriers. The range of activities outlined in the Act are far too narrow. For example, the bill outlines the procurement of goods and services, but not for facilities. Thus, the range of activities where accessibility is to be secured needs to broaden. The obligated organizations outlined in the bill are far too tailored. The list should be expanded to include all organizations that contract with the federal government and organizations that receive federal funding in order to eliminate the risk of federal funding being used to create more accessibility barriers. The bill outlines that accessibility regulations take precedence over human rights obligations. This provision needs to be amended immediately. The Act burdens those with disabilities with the expectation to become accessibility consultants with every obligated organization, thus requiring them to consult with organizations year after year advocating for the same accessibility provisions to be implemented. The Act requires that each organization create their own process for consulting with individuals with disabilities. Not having a standardized method for consultation can result in inconsistent practices. And lastly, the Act lacks provisions regarding Aboriginal people, particularly those with disabilities. So in conclusion, the Act sets out to improve accessibility standards for those with disabilities Canada-wide in hopes of improving their quality of life. The Act will hopefully spark awareness regarding barriers experienced by those with disabilities. This Act will hopefully bring about change in attitude and behavior towards those experiencing life with disabilities. Bill C-81 is not final as of yet. A lengthy process has barely begun. Debates will be held by the Senate and will undergo more readings before becoming official. So although the Act has many shortcomings, it is a giant leap forward in the right direction, a more inclusive direction.